Hello, and welcome to the Educational Success Podcast. I am your host, Troy Moore, and today our questions are brought to us by a Grand Canyon professor, Kimber Underdown. Thank you, Kimber, for your questions. We'll get into those in just a minute. Our schedule for today includes roles of special education teachers. Then once we do that, I'm going to read a letter to help us begin ourselves into looking at personal bias. Then we're going to dive into personal bias and the types that we see. And then we're going to look at dispositions. We have a great list from the Grand Canyon University. They have 10 dispositions for educators, and each one of them is super important. Once we talk about those biases, we're going to look at which dispositions will become difficult once those biases arise within your classroom and within yourself as a teacher. Then we're going to have a self-reflect time. I'm going to self-reflect upon myself and the dispositions that I have and need. You can also join me in doing that. I'll list up the 10 in a little bit towards the end of the podcast so you can kind of get a guess for yourself. And then once that is finished, that'll be the end of our podcast today. But we have an action-packed schedule, so let's go ahead and jump on into roles of special education teachers. Let's talk about our roles in special education as special education teachers. The first one I want to talk about is supportive learning. So how are you as a special education teacher going to support your students with special needs? Now, in order to do that, you got to be able to get up out of the chair. You got to walk around. You got to get to learn students. So if you don't learn anything about them, how are you going to be able to support them when they say they need this or they need that? You won't know what they need because you haven't been able to meet them and talk with them at all. And even their accommodations, if you don't look at them or you don't put them into perspective when you're creating lessons, those accommodations won't show up within that. So the next thing let's talk about improving planning and practice. So if let's say you have a lesson and that lesson doesn't go as well as you seemed. Well, each one of those processes needs to be within the next lesson you teach. To improve means that the next lesson you teach, it might not be perfect, but it's gonna be better than the last one. But in order to do that, how do you improve? Well, you need to plan. So how can we plan better? Well, you first have to look at yourself and say, well, what did I do that didn't make that lesson go as well? You got to be able to self-reflect with yourself and self-search to be able to find why this lesson did not go as well as you planned. And then how can I plan better? With practice. Nobody goes out there the first day and has just a great time. And if you do, that's fine. But you always need to practice. Practice your lessons. Make sure you practice implementing accommodations of your students into your lessons. And each one of those things, improve, planning, and practice, will all go together. And it'll be amazing what things you can do for your students. Next, upholding professional expectations and ethics. Being able to uphold looking like a professional. How do I become a pro? We got to show up on time. It definitely goes back to being able to prep and plan and improve. Because if you're not being a professional and you're not trying to improve and you're not showing up on time, you're not going to have the job. Teaching is all about being able to improve and plan and move forward. And you're not being a professional if you're not doing that. And ethics, being able to be like, this is a topic that I should bring up, or this is a topic I shouldn't bring up, based upon how well you know your class, as well as how well you know the curriculum in which you're working. Lastly, let's talk about collaborative advancing the profession. Teaching is not a solo job. You need to be able to interact with other teachers, because if you can give advice with other teachers when they are in need, you're not only benefiting that teacher, you're benefiting your students because they might have that same teacher just in a different subject, as well as when you need help. If you've refused not allowed yourself to work together with other teachers, you will be left out on an island, and nobody wants that. So those are what roles you need to fulfill. I also have written on here, if you've seen the picture before, keys to success for special education teachers, because these are the main keys. These are super important to focus. Got the letter here. It's written to me a couple of years ago. This teacher has vastly improved, I'm sure of it, by this time, but this is just an example. I have clearance to share this story with this teacher. So they wrote to me, "Hello, Troy. I currently teach 5th grade special education. I have a student in my class that is super smart, but recently has transitioned to becoming a girl. Could this be the reason my student is doing so poorly?" Now, on the face of it, it seems like that teacher really, really cares about that student, and they want to know why. But when you look at it, the reasoning behind why they think their student is doing so poorly, you get a bias there. Whether that be a political bias, could be a political bias, it could be that they don't agree with that, or it could be gender bias. Those two biases both play in here. So before we really get deep into biases, we gotta see which ones are we talking about. So I want to bring up four biases that we often see within education. The first one is gender. Whether that is a teacher prefers boys over girls, or that teacher has a problem with there being more than 2 genders within their classroom. And that is a problem within teaching. The second one, confirmation, which also could be known as getting the right answer and then moving on forward. Third one, favoritism. So favoriting a student compared to other students. Then the last one I want to talk about is a cultural bias, and we'll get into those in just a minute. So go ahead and follow me on over. We're going to do an overview of biases and talk about dispositions that would be hard to keep intact when you have those biases. What dispositions are we looking at here? So we have high expectations, respect for diversity of others, fairness, professional conduct, reflection, curiosity, honesty, compassion, advocacy, and dedication. So all those are going into play within being able to be a leader within the classroom. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk about which dispositions are we going to struggle with when we have the biases I mentioned earlier. When we have a gender bias, you will struggle with high expectations. You'll have a high expectation of one gender over the other. Professional conduct. When you have a gender preference, you tend to have less professionalism within your classroom, depending on which gender you're just talking to, either the one you prefer or the one that you don't. Fairness. You can't be fair to all genders within your classroom if you have a bias towards one. And so these are things that you have to work on. When you have this bias, forming relationships with students is very difficult because they can feel your gender bias within the classroom. And that can become a problem as well when you talk to families. So discussion with parents, because those students are taking what they see and they're going to share it with those parents. And if you don't have a way to back it up besides your bias, that's going to be a problem for you. We got confirmation bias. So that's when you're calling on people, getting an answer, and then moving on. You're not having a respect for a diversity of others. If you did, then you would call on all the kids that raise their hand because they might have a different opinion compared to somebody else. It might not be what you're looking for and it might add time, but that doesn't mean that you should dismay that student and take them away. Curiosity. Your curiosity is going to be lacking in your confirmation bias because if you're just going for one answer and you get it and you move on, you're not curious about what all the other kids have to say. You're not intrigued and in the moment with your students. And then dedication. If you are planning for students to say one answer and then you get it and then you move on, you're not dedicated to them. You're just worried about the time that's showing up. And so these are the dispositions with confirmation bias that'll become a real problem. And you can have a bad relationship with your students. Less participation will occur because you're not calling on as many. Favoritism, high expectations, once again, because you have a higher expectation of that student that you favorite, and then everyone else just trickles down the line. Professional conduct, again, you can't be a professional if you're favoriting students, because you might get that student something that nobody else got. Also, if that student doesn't become your favorite anymore and you treat them worse, they're not going to like that. So you cannot favor students at all, because at some point either you're going to fall out with the favorited student, or the rest of your class is just going to not enjoy the rest of the time in there. And then honesty. A lot of teachers are not honest about themselves, saying, yes, I have a problem. I have favorited this student. I need to stop doing that. That is a problem that we face within the favoritism bias. You have a bad relationship with the favorite student because that is not a positive relationship for schools. And then you also have a negative relationship with all the rest of the students in the class because they can feel that favoritism, and that is a negative, especially for classroom and classroom management as well. Let's go on to the last one, cultural bias, respect for the diversity of others. If you have a cultural bias, you're not going to listen to somebody else who you think, man, that person doesn't agree with what I agree, and I don't really want to hear what they have to say. Then you're stopping all students from being able to share. And especially with the diversity of classes, some classes need that diversity in there to succeed. And then compassion. Well, if you're not willing to listen to the student and listen to what they have to say, or let them tell you what they have going on in their life because you have a cultural bias towards them, then you won't ever form a relationship with that student. And then advocacy. How can you advocate for students in your class when you culturally have a bias towards them, so you don't learn anything about them? You don't care to learn anything about them. And these accommodations and everything, those need to all come together. Because if you have a bad relationship with the student and the parents, your meetings are not going to go as planned because you have no evidence to back up why that student's struggling besides your cultural bias. Lastly, let's go ahead and talk about the dispositions that I have and dispositions that I will need when I become my first year teacher here. It starts in a couple days for me, so I really got to focus here. The first one that I think I have is a respect for diversity. The reason I say that is I have gone through school as a kid through a lot of non-diverse classes and non-diverse populations within my school. The school that I've been working at currently, diversity is immense compared to my other class. And so I've learned to listen to others who may be culturally different than me, but their perspective can help me to understand them as well as others in the class. One thing I need is the ability to be honest with myself. As a first year teacher, if I'm not honest with myself, I'll have a bad lesson and be like, oh, the whole thing was bad. But maybe there was one student who came up and said something, and maybe they said something when they raised their hand or something like that. And I'm gonna be able to see that and take that as a positive. So being honest with myself on exactly what happened is key. Professional conduct is something that I think that I have as one of the dispositions that I excel at. The reasoning behind this is I have seen a lot of unprofessionalism in my time, whether that be before I got into education or while I'm in schools. And so being able to recognize that has allowed me to make a list of professional things that I require, such as dressing nice. That is something that I pride myself on and I require myself to do, as well as show up on time. One thing that I do need is reflection. So I do need to reflect on every lesson that I have, because good lessons or bad lessons, I need to look at exactly what happened and be like, well, how could I improve that? How could I make an accommodation that I missed implemented in the next lesson? And that is also important for meetings. When a student is struggling, I need to have the ability to reflect on what I need. Next, we got compassion. That is something that I think that I have. And my ability to have compassion, I have love for all the students that are in my classes. And the ability for me to have compassion is what is continuing to drive me to get to know them and get to know what they need within classes. On the flip side of that, what I need is I need to focus on advocacy. Because if I'm not able to advocate for my students, then my compassion is there for nothing. Because I learn about these students, I do everything I can, but I'm not advocating for their success in school. And so being there, making sure I'm advocating for their success, to combine it with compassion, is something I'm definitely going to need as a first-year teacher. And so these are the topics that we're covering today for our podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I hope some of this has helped you and it'll help you in the future.